Hello, Bill.
Good afternoon, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everybody.
The second DMZ this week.
Bill, two DMZs. You were on. We did a Zoom chat together, which I think was fabulous.
Well, that's my second conversation with you this week, but I sidelined you earlier in the week for I'm always going to mispronounce his name, Micah Utrecht from Jacobin. We had a discussion about the socialist response to coronavirus that I critiqued in Politico. He took some issue, but very civilly, very thoughtfully, and we had a good chat. So if you haven't caught that conversation, I think it was worth your time, even though it wasn't Matt Lewis.
Well, I want to check it out, and I have to say, sadly, I feel like podcasting is taking a little hit right now as well. People are not commuting because they don't have anywhere to go. They're not going to the gym. Even when I go out for a jog, I usually have to take my kids because they're home all the time and they need exercise. And so I'm not listening to podcasts as much. And so I haven't had time, but this is on my list that I want to listen to. And by the way, let me just say thank you to everyone who joined our Zoom call, which I think was a really good discussion. And thanks, Bill. I guess you did 3 DMZs this week, really.
Well, I did. I had three online chats, 2 official
Yes.
DMZ, 1 unofficial DMZ Zoom chat with you.
DMZ Light.
And in between those things, Matt, I managed to knock out a Politico piece.
Yes.
It was literally between the Tuesday Zoom chat and now. I basically cranked on it all of Tuesday afternoon and evening into the wee hours, then knocked it off by 1 p.m. Wednesday. My ranking, 6 best and 6 worst governors responding to the coronavirus crisis, which I thought was going to get me seriously dragged for doing a cheap listicle in a time of in a pandemic. And not that I haven't gotten some of that, but I do think I got more positive feedback than negative, surprisingly enough.
Well, look, I think the way you did it is very appropriate. It's a substantive piece. It's perfectly relevant because you're ranking them according to how they're responding to a deadly serious pandemic. I think you brought the receipts. And look, I don't think it's plausible to expect political analysts to essentially not do political analysis for the indefinite future. So I wouldn't worry about that pushback to the extent you got it. And it sounds like you didn't get much of it. I've seen a lot of people, a lot of buzz and positive feedback for this piece.
Well, just so folks, if you haven't read it yet, I'll give you just a brief overview. So I made a couple of controversial decisions.
I'm sorry, but I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
and I probably shouldn't have, but it occurs to me, I think this is actually an important point, though. The part of the reason that I think it's fine to do political analysis is that it's not gonna help the virus. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like if you criticize Donald Trump, you could argue that is. Someone could certainly argue that that's harming our unity at this moment and but you're not emboldening the virus. You know what I mean? You're not aiding and abetting the virus.
Well,
this is not a foreign government that this is not World War II or something.
No, but even in World War II, people can critique what their political leaders are doing and question whether they're doing the right thing. There were questions about whether the procurement process of supplies was on the level. Was there corruption going on? You need to prevent that stuff from happening while it's happening. You don't want to wait and let all the corruption occur and then go check on it later. You need to do it in real time, and that's a pain. But that's life in a crisis.
And you didn't. And again, I'm going to interrupt you to praise you, which is to say, because you did do something that was focused on politics, but it wasn't even just because it's a listicle doesn't mean it's inherently a superficial horse race story. Again, I mean, you were ranking them based on their performance in the capacity of their office of governor during a very serious time.
Yeah, and obviously you can obviously take issue with, oh, this person should have been number one, you left off this person, all that kind of stuff. In my mind, like, the important thing isn't the numbers. I hope you get something out of the piece, whether or not you agree with the precise order of things. And obviously, if I miss something important, that's bad, but it's hard to cover everything when you're talking about 50 states plus territories. But the important thing to me was, number one, to be a little bit contrarian about Andrew Cuomo. And mind you, I'm a child of I'm a New Yorker of the 80s. I grew up loving Mario Cuomo. I interned for Mario Cuomo for a summer in my college years. And I actually have a lot of respect for Andrew Cuomo. But I thought, you know what? As good as he is on TV, there are legitimate questions about the quickness of the response. He wasn't first on stay at home. He wasn't first on school closures. And they're having the worst time managing the spread. So it didn't seem right to me to say I'm going to put him at the top. I mean, considering that my analysis was first and foremost political, it wouldn't have been wrong to put him at the top or near the top, because he has obviously lifted his political star in this process. But I thought at some point people are going to start digging into some of the decisions here, and that's probably going to dim that star to some degree. I'm not going to put him in the top six.
And he wasn't as bad as De Blasio, but weren't there occasions a little bit later in the game than you might have liked to have seen, set to sound like something Trump would say, when Cuomo was basically saying, like, go about your business, go shopping, that kind of thing?
Well, the Cuomo-De Blasio relationship is bad, and the badness of that is impacting the response. That's part of the story, and you can say, well, it was always bad. Yeah, it's not good to have a bad relationship between a governor and the biggest city in his state, and whose fault is that? We act like it's on the playground, but at the end of the day, those relationships matter, and they impacted the response here. So you had Cuomo saying early on, we should have more school closures. Hey, De Blasio, you should look at that. As opposed to Cuomo saying, I'm closing all those schools myself. So and this was the time when De Blasio was saying, I don't want to close the schools. I'm going to fight closing the schools because it's such an important resource for our poorer families, which is not it's not a horrible impulse, but I think objectively the wrong impulse looking back. And then after De Blasio did make that move and the schools did get closed, then De Blasio was pushing shelter in place and Cuomo was pushing back on shelter in place. So they had this public dance that wasn't productive. That's relevant. Whereas Mike DeWine in Ohio, who didn't have a massive outbreak, wasn't in the top states in mid-March in terms of caseload. He's the guy that closes schools first. He sparks the national wave of school closures. That's leadership. You got to give a guy credit for that. And I don't love the way he handled the election, quite frankly. I don't love snubbing the court order, but you do have to give him some credit for sparking a nationwide postponement of primaries. It was a leadership role, however awkward and constitutionally questionable it still was a leadership role. And he's not being ideological. He's pushing back on Trump. He's being driven by data. And so far, at least, his caseload is relatively modest compared to the nation. That might change. No one's out of the woods here yet. But I thought that deserved credit. That's why I put him at number one.
Mike DeWine, number one.
Number
one in your heart, number one in your list.
And so you had
a guy who has a lot of experience, right? A guy who's been a U.S. senator, been an attorney general, and now been a governor.
This is literally a career public servant. This is not a guy with private sector experience. Never ran a business, never met a payroll, but he had the experience in government to know. Yeah. I see where this is going. It's not good. I know what levers are available to me, and I'm going to use them. And this is why I think the ranking matters, because people are starting to realize the hard way that governmental experience does matter if it is used well. I mean, you can be experienced and still do a bad job.
But we had gotten to a point where experience was actually a liability.
Yeah.
Not only did it not help you, it was a liability. And now hopefully if something good comes out of all of this, maybe one thing will be that we put a little more stock in experience.
Now
by the way, I don't want to move on from your piece quite yet. Right after your piece published, Bill, it now comes out that Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, until like yesterday, didn't realize that you could spread coronavirus if you were still
asymptomatic.
If that's the word. That's the word I'm looking for. Asymptomatic.
Yeah, I mean, Kemp was the kind of guy who was sort of on my bubble. And this was before that statement. Maybe that would have put him over the top if I had written it on Thursday and not Wednesday. And I can be accused of going out of my way to make the list bipartisan, but I did have one Democrat. Most of the people on the worst list are Republicans, generally because they were resisting stay-at-home orders and then some. I mean, there are more governors than 6 who are resisting stay-at-home orders. But DeSantis of Florida was number one. Not only resisted stay-at-home, but was clearly dragging his feet when spring break was happening, and was trying to make a big deal about doing his quarantines. Well, the New Yorkers can't come here, and New Jersey folks can't come here, Louisiana folks can't come here. Meanwhile, your spring breakers are spreading coronavirus across the country.
Yeah. Have you seen the latest 2 things I've seen about him are, one, he now says that he changed his mind finally because Trump's, quote, demeanor changed.
Right.
The other thing is, and I need to verify this, but I think it's true, he said that people on those cruise ships, if they're Florida residents, he will let them off. Mm-hmm. But not other people. Other people stuck on those cruise ships cannot come off. Not on his state.
I mean, this sort of provincial attitude, it's sort of like America first, but in a state setting. That's about your people are clean and the other people are not. Like, that's just not how viruses work. And
it's not our problem. It's not our problem. We're not gonna. I mean, look, I was pissed off when when England wouldn't let our the Iranian hostages hide out like in their embassy or whatever. I guess Canada did, right? And but that's a different country. I mean, we're supposed to be friends. We're supposed to be allies. We're supposed to have a special relationship. But you can understand it's a different country. But we're all part of the United States, and to sort of have that attitude, I don't know, it's not good.
And so the other folks on the worst list, not only were resisting stay at home, but were being particularly awful communicators. Tate Reeves in Mississippi initially putting out an order that would supersede local attempts to have stay-at-home orders, and then having to come out and say, I didn't quite mean to do that, but maybe I kind of did, and still the mayors today were confused what he was trying to accomplish. And then, actually, I think an hour before it published, I think we fixed the piece. He fined the stay-at-home order. That kind of stuff I thought was merited extra sanction. And then you had 2 governors, one Democrat, one Republican, who got into spats with their lieutenant governors. And in Hawaii, a Democratic governor, David Ige, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his last name, his lieutenant governor is an emergency room physician. And he initially taps him to be a point person on coronavirus. Lieutenant governor starts going out there arguing for very stiff measures, particularly because here's a case where you have travelers, people trying to escape their states so they can ride out coronavirus in paradise. And you're having the lieutenant governor saying, don't let that happen. You got to lock that down. And the governor apparently resisting that because the state's so tourism dependent. And then instead of listening to the advice, tells his cabinet, I don't want you talking to the lieutenant governor. I don't want a lieutenant governor in my press conferences. Now he fixed that. That's been papered over now, and he has done the orders since. But even when he had the quarantine order for tourists, he gave them a 5-day lead time. So if you already booked your flight, you still could get it under the wire. In Alabama, Governor Ivey, her lieutenant governor, they're elected separately. So they weren't running mates per se. But the lieutenant governor has been giving public messages saying, hey, governor's task force, you are dragging your feet. You're not doing X, Y, and Z. This is a serious problem. You're not taking it seriously. And the governor's having to publicly shoot back against her lieutenant governor. Those are the kinds of dances where I think that gives you extra demerits in my book.
Well, one thing for sure is Mike Pence won't be taking those kind of shots at President Trump.
Well, that's right. So, but I want to ask you, though, Matt, because you had a tweet storm today.
Yes.
Saying you think this is going to help Trump politically and is going to further the populist element in the Republican Party. Is it possible that because DeWine has done so well, Larry Hogan in Maryland is doing relatively well. These are folks who are not singing the Trump songbook, didn't push back hard on stay at home. I mean, DeWine was better than Hogan, but Hogan got there. Whereas all these Southern governors have generally been resisting Trump and maybe, and there just was in the Times today, travel patterns show that the travel patterns in the South are far more active than in the rest of the country.
Yes.
So they may be suffering a late wave of cases because they weren't taking it seriously. Might you see Republicans saying, oh, well, that didn't work. Trump gave me bad information. Maybe I need more Republicans like Mike DeWine who are going to actually take care of business. So, first of all, let me just correct something you said. I think this is bad for Trump. Okay. Very bad for Trump. Okay.
I think, we just saw the jobs report today, all the people who filed for unemployment. There are people who say, look, his approval ratings are up. I can't imagine how this maybe Trump turns it around. There's enough time between now and November. But as of now, I think this looks very, very, very bad for Trump politically because he clearly botched this. The point that I was making, though, which I do believe is true, is that there are going to be a lot of ramifications once we come out of coronavirus. A lot of it's going to change the way we are we going to be shaking hands anymore? I can only hope not, but that may be there's going to be some.
I don't plan to. I'll tell you that.
There's going to be some interesting Some of them will be unforeseen.
How fashionable will our masks get? Who will have the bougiest masks?
I heard Jonah Goldberg talking about the other day on his podcast about having a convention, a political convention where you could have branded merch, masks. You could have a Republican mask or a Trump mask or a Biden mask. Yeah, we could end up there, right? Americans are not a mask people. It really, masks go against a lot of our, ethos, but maybe we become mask people. I don't know.
You have a MAGA mask. You can have an American flag mask.
I say own it if you're Trump. Start making them now. Make them in China.
Sell them on the campaign website.
Get them yeah, totally. So, but I think that although, and look, I think we're poised for a very bad year for Trump and Republicans, and I think deservedly so. But the point that I was making in my tweet storm is, I think if you look at the ramifications of this, think of it. Okay, so one of the things I've always been an advocate for is new urbanism. People who live in walkable communities, that is more high density typically. I think now you're going to have more people choosing to flee cities and move to rural areas. And by the way, I think that there is a connection between, it's not just that conservative people stay in rural areas and more progressive people are attracted to cities. I believe that living in a rural area to some degree will make you more conservative in your voting. So I think that it's hard to I don't want to confuse like causation and correlation, but more people moving to more rural areas will probably have the impact of making more people more conservative, like in some ways. But the actual point of my tweet storm is, so one of the ramifications of this, I think, is going to be if people like me who were very anti-populist, for lack of a better term. I'm not a populist. And so, for example, when people like Rick Santorum talked about wanting to have tax benefits so that we can build factories in America, that struck me as protectionist and interventionist and a lot of things I don't like. And I still think it's bad economics. But you can now make a pretty compelling argument that there's a national security interest in doing things like that, especially when it comes to the way that we offshored the production of these masks, to go back to the masks, to China. I mean, obviously, the fact that we didn't really have a national stockpile is also problematic. But I think you can now make – there are people like me who were very skeptical of the populism, and I still hate the nationalism, but skeptical of the populism, who are now like, maybe we should start treating China a little more overtly as an enemy or at least an adversary. That doesn't mean we should be mean to Asian Americans. Certainly we should not do that. But maybe we should start treating China a little more aggressively. They clearly tried to hide this and cover this up. I'm not buying the conspiracy theory that they made it, but, so I think that while Trump is in bad shape, what we're starting to see is the potential for a post-Trump Republican Party that is a more serious, because if you get rid of Trump, you're automatically more serious, right? So a more serious Republican Party, but also a more populist one that, and I think where you could incorporate people like me, by virtue of everything I've just laid out, in with the Tom Cottons and the Josh Hawleys of the world. And so I guess my point is, for the first time, I'm starting to see, even though Donald Trump's immediate fortunes look bad to me, I'm starting to see the potential for a Republican Party that is able to put the pieces back together, the coalition back together, and sort of have a hybrid of the old Reagan coalition, only a little more populist than before.
Do you think it's possible, though, that could happen at the same time Republicans conclude, this is assuming Trump loses because of all this, that we need to get back to being good managers again? We used to be known as a responsible party, not a Looney Tunes crazy party. And we need more Mike DeWines and not Donald Trump Jr. after this.
Look, totally. I hope that happens. I think that it would make perfect sense. I mean, you could be a populist who really cares about constituent service. I mean, that kind of makes sense if you think about it. I mean, I know that we've always had these sort of demagogues like Huey Long and all that, but I mean, but we also had machine politicians, and we all, so I mean, like, I think it's very possible that you can have a conservative, populist worldview that is also competent and focused on actually delivering for your constituents. And so we could end up having, I don't think the things we're talking about are mutually exclusive, certainly.
Now, you mentioned earlier, sorry.
What do you think about that? I'd like to know what you think about.
Well, I don't think they're, by definition, they're not mutually exclusive. I think the unknown is, will Republicans develop a level of sophistication where they can, walk those two paths? Or even if they're not becoming, anti-China populists, can they at least put two and two together and say, you can be a conservative in whatever flavor you want while still being respectful of the need for governmental expertise?
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, and this has been such an interesting thing because you have people like Candace Owens and Diamond and Silk who are basically still saying, like, this is no big deal. You know what I mean? And you've got people like Steve Bannon who are and Tucker Carlson who are like, think this is huge. You know what I mean? And so, like, this has been a weird there's been some weird cross currents in the conservative movement. But I think it's pretty easy to imagine. Excuse me. That was annoying. I think it's pretty easy to imagine the future that I've laid out, because all you have to imagine is Donald Trump is gone and Mike Pence is president. And if that happened, wouldn't he do exactly what I just basically described? It makes perfect sense to me. Will Trump ever disappear? Will he be rejected? Will he, that's the question.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Trump has received a bit of a poll bump in the past couple of weeks. Now, we have also seen a Michigan poll and a Wisconsin poll where I think Biden was ahead by 3 in both polls that I've seen in those two states. And I know in the Wisconsin poll, it was a slight bump for Biden in the trial heat. I think Biden went up 2 points and Trump went down 1 point. And also Biden was trouncing Bernie. That primary is Tuesday. That primary is on. They've been trying to, the governor there has been trying to encourage mail-in absentee voting, and he wanted to go all mail-in, but the Republicans and the legislature wouldn't let him do it. They thought it was an unrealistic timeline. So there will be in-person voting there on Tuesday. But this was a state that was very Bernie-friendly. Bernie beat Hillary there in 2016, but unless something really bizarre happens with the turnout patterns, it would seem that Biden is going to have this in the bag and is holding an edge in the general election. Not so much that you'd say it's no longer a purple state, but we haven't really seen the slight uptick in Trump's approval translating into a national edge over Biden or a swing state edge over Biden. Is that a fair reading of what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's fair. And look, I think there's so many things here that we have to consider. It makes sense to me that there would be some sort of a rally around the flag effect. But Dr. Fauci is saying now that the low estimate is 100,000 lives. Americans are going to die. And the unemployment numbers that just came out, how many millions of Americans filed for unemployment?
Well, I thought the number was over 6 million. Between the 2 weeks, it's about 10 million, right?
So I imagine that if Dr. Fauci's estimates end up being correct, and if they are correct, then the unemployment numbers are going to get worse. If that happens, I have a hard time seeing how Donald Trump gets reelected. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time seeing how anybody gets reelected, especially when there is such documentable evidence that he really botched the first 6 weeks or so of this. Now look, Trump defies logic. It's hard to tell. The rules don't apply to Trump, but there's just so many reasons why this looks so bad. For another example would be, this is probably going to be my next column, but right now is when George H.W. Bush started defining Michael Dukakis. Right now is when Bill Clinton started defining Bob Dole. Right now is when George W. Bush and the flip-flop thing happened with John Kerry. Right now is when Barack Obama started putting the heat to Mitt Romney in the spring. Mm-hmm. And that's been, I know Bush, the Dukakis example, Bush was only effectively the incumbent. He wasn't really the incumbent president. But the other examples, there's been this thing where incumbent presidents have used this exact time, essentially when the out party presumptive nominee has basically wrapped up the primary, but before the convention, to define them. And Trump can't really do that to Joe Biden right now for a whole bunch of reasons.
I mean, he started to in March. You were already on Sleepy Joe. They're pushing out the chopped up clips to try to suggest he was in cognitive decline. So, and not to mention there was an entire impeachment. There was the whole thing with Burisma that they were pushing at the turn of the year to try to, scuff him up early. Those efforts have not only been stalled, but I do think that, however imperfect you think Biden is behaving in this in the crisis period, the most histrionic assessments of his state of mind are not holding up. He is cogent in his TV appearances. He is cogent in his town halls. It's only when you isolate, a moment where maybe he's, searching for a word that you can try to give a distorted picture. But there's enough that you see of him where that doesn't really add up. And so I think they've overshot the attempted negative definition at a time when they really can't prosecute it very hard.
Oh, not only can Trump not – there's two reasons Trump can't prosecute it, right? Number one, he's busy. Number two, not only would it look unseemly, but it would reinforce the narrative that Trump isn't focused on saving lives. So Trump can't really do this. But also, Biden is able to present a more curated image of himself by virtue of the fact of social distancing, right? So this is really playing very well. And I was convinced, by the way, Mickey Kaus was recently on with Bob Wright, and I love it when they're together. I think they should do it every week. They should do their show every week, just like another show that I'm a fan of, the DMZ. But Mickey Kaus convinced me that Biden can just simply not disappear completely, but do the 4-hour work week until like September. I guess now the convention has been moved to August 17th or whatever, so maybe till August. But Biden could recede and then come back, and in a way, because the news cycles have been sped up, he would be tanned and rested and fresh. And I've been convinced now that this seems like, again, let's put the obvious caveat out there, Bill, just like when you're doing a listicle column for Politico magazine. The most important thing is this huge pandemic, which you and I can't do much about. But if we're doing political analysis, and that's kind of what we get paid to do, I think this benefits politically Joe Biden. That's my take. And people disagree. It's not obvious to everybody, but I think it's hard to say anything else right now.
Yeah, I think it helps Biden that he has experience with pandemics. he can articulate, here are the things that I would be doing. So I know there's talk about Trump and Biden having a phone call, which I imagine will get interpreted very differently by both sides if it actually occurs. But
there's talk of Trump and Biden having a phone call.
Yes. I saw that today.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
I don't know how serious that is, and I only saw it on Twitter, so I haven't seen the full article. I don't know who first floated this, and what the likelihood of it actually happening is going to be. But I agree that Biden doesn't need to overdo it. He doesn't need to be flooding the zone in the media at this point. Even if he could, which probably you can't even if he wanted to. I think he needs to be there enough to show, hey, I'm not losing my mind. I'm still a functioning human. Yeah. And I have things to say about what's going on here that lets you know how I would perform in a crisis. And I do think he is achieving that. But
I think that's right.
But
I think that's right. No, it's just... my original, well, I hate to say my original, but at some point I was a little worried because I felt like Biden needed to be relevant. Biden needed to be in every news cycle. He needed to have a shadow government, a shadow Fauci, he needed to have shadow, sort of press conferences every day and all, But I'm past that. I think that was wrong. I think he can recede, not completely disappear, but I think he doesn't need to play a game he can't win.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no way you can match Trump in exposure at this point. Yeah. And also, to the extent Trump has exposure, it's very double-edged for him because he is not always his own best messenger in these moments. I mean, yeah, he's gotten a few points uptick. The governors are getting, 30, 40-point boosts. There's a limit to how much Trump can squeeze out of this for himself. And I mean, it's an open question whether, maybe a few points is enough. Maybe that's all he needs to thread the needle here.
Here's the other thing, too. How many presidents – so running for president's got to be just physically daunting for people. Yeah. Even if you're young. Mm-hmm. I mean, never mind being old. If you're young, it's physically daunting. I bet you Biden's getting 8 to 10 hours sleep a night now. right. That's got to be good for him. Yeah. Even if you're not in cognitive decline, it's a grueling process. And so this has to be good for him physically. I mean, now look, I don't know what kind of precautions Biden's people are taking, but the one thing that would really mess this up is if Biden actually, got sick.
Yes, right? I mean, absolutely. And I can only assume you got to think taking every precaution, although, we're only just learning now to what extent this can be aerosolized, that you can get it through breathing. So, I don't know if folks are wearing masks around them before. Maybe they were. But that's the kind of thing that you have to worry about where they think they're doing their best and their best wasn't good enough. But so far it seems they haven't had that problem.
Well, I think we're pretty awesome, Bill. This is a great show. As always.
So why don't we call it a day, and perhaps we'll Zoom again early next week. I don't know what your plans are, but I'm available to you if so desired.
I think we should do it. I want to thank. I've heard from a couple people who are fans of the DMZ who are supporting our podcasts, and who, one of them was on our Zoom call. Who spoke to us and said that specifically the reason that he's doing it, that he's supporting us, is because he's a fan of the DMZ. So thank you.
So if you want to get in on those, you got to become a Patreon supporter for one of us.
Yeah.
And I'm using it to try to get a history podcast off the ground. And you are doing other side projects as well.
Yes. Well, I was doing these video interview podcasts, right, which are a little expensive, and I was hoping to pivot to video completely, but yeah, basically, I don't think we're not going to get rich off of the Patreon, but it can subsidize the cost of both in terms of time and equipment and all that bandwidth of doing the podcast. So we are appreciative, and we love doing the Zoom. The great thing with you, Bill, and I've had other, guests on my Zoom, but when you and I do it, it's easy like Sunday morning. I mean, we don't need a lot of, we just do the show and it works out. So
excellent. Always good to talk to you, Matt, even in these troubled times, and we'll talk apparently multiple times next week.
Yeah. America needs us now more than ever, Bill. See you guys in the DMZ.
Take care.